We had the first conversation in our Lenten study this week, our Lenten study that focuses on the abundance that's contained in everything that God is and that God has created. Our first conversation took place around the first chapter of the book of Genesis. So that very first part of the Bible where God creates everything in the first 6 days of anything. There are a lot of words in this chapter, and so much of it is so familiar as we go over God's account of creating everything in the world in 6 days. We've heard it so often that very often we forget to stop and look at the details in this text. And it's a text that is full of an awful lot of detail. There are way more words there than we actually need. One of our aims in this Bible study is to not necessarily read the texts in a modern way, meaning for instruction or for guidance in a very concrete way, a verifiable, empirical, true-false kind of way, but really to ask a specific question of the text that has to do with the source of the text, God. What does God look like in this text? What is God trying to tell us in this text? And so we gathered this week and looked at the story of creation. And there were all kinds of interesting issues and questions that came up in our discussion. The very first one to come up is around the statement that God created humankind in his own image. Image of what? What does God look like? God, of course, does not have a physical form that we recognize. So asking the question of what does God look like so that we can figure out what we look like actually takes us straight to looking at God and what he looks like through what he creates. And I apologize for using the pronoun he. What does God look like in this text? Well, what we discovered was that this God likes boundaries. He separates the water from the earth. He separates night from day. He separates the fish into the water and the birds in the air and the plants and the animals on the earth. Everything has its particular appointed place in God's creation. Another thing we found out about is that everything is self-starting once God has created it. The fish in the water will multiply and thrive. The plants on the earth contain seeds and will be able to thrive and multiply on their own after God's creation. The birds in the air will do the same. And when God creates humankind, men and women will be able to thrive and multiply through their own devices. And in fact, God gives humankind dominion over everything else that God has created. So there's so much to take in, so much to appreciate in how God has given everything that God creates the ability to live and thrive through its own created self. And so when God is saying, "And it was good," at the end of each great creative act, God is in fact saying that God trusts that which he has created. trusts that it will live and thrive and be itself. And of course, God rests on the seventh day. And we talked about how you can't really rest unless you can trust that the work or the people that you have left behind in order to rest are going to do exactly what you hope they will. So God is, of course, powerful and creative. But this creative act is filled with an abundance. The abundance to give other forms a life that they can sustain on their own. And God's creation contains an abundance of trust. A trust that life will evolve as it is supposed to, as God wishes it to be. And the ultimate act of divine trust, of making humankind in God's own image, of being creative, of being able to do things with life, and like everything else that's created, to be able to survive and thrive and multiply on our own. Such an act of trust. Acts of trust born of love, a love so abundant we can't even put our minds around it. And so we enter into this story through the lens of our own impoverished world, through the lens of a world where we know that we have interfered with and harmed God's creation, knowing that this trust and this love was there at the very start. A trust and a love that invites us into something better, into something grander, into something so much more abundant than what we can currently imagine. And so we will journey on to our next stop in this exploration of God's abundance, when we will look at God's people in the desert in the book of Exodus and how God provides for them. We hope to see you there. Blessings.